Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rumi Forum. Some of you have been here with us before, but some of you it's your first time. We're all very honored to host you here this evening for this Ramadan Iftar dinner. As you know, as many of you know, that Ramadan is the 9th month in the Islamic calendar, and Muslims fast for 30 days each year in this month. And it's a time to be with family and friends and to share at the iftar table with those you know and some people that you don't know. But it's a time to be neighborly, a time to reflect, a time to be with family and those that you love. So we're very happy to be with you all this evening. We have a full schedule. We have some very good speakers and a very good program. Following the dinner, we will hear from our friends Soltes and Pim Valkenberg. And then after that, we will reconvene back into the middle room in the other part of the office space, and we will have Turkish coffee. You will see some Ebru art performed. It will be a very nice time and presentation for you all to enjoy, and some apple tea, which is also something special to Turkey. So with that, I believe it is now time to break the fast.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha
Ladies and gentlemen, can I now direct your eyes to the stage here and to the screen? We're just going to show you a brief video about what exactly the Rumi Forum is and does. And then after that, we will hear from Professor Dr. Soltes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be anywhere where the Rumi Forum is being, especially when there's food involved, and there's always food involved, so it's always a pleasure to be here. Sidki actually asked me if I would say a few words about Ramadan in the context of and with respect to the human family at large, and that's really an easy thing to do when you think about what the idea of fasting is as a kind of human endeavor which cuts across the myriad cultures and civilizations that define humanity. Fasting is one of the ways in which we discipline ourselves and separate ourselves from the other species, the other animals that have aspects of themselves in common with aspects of us, but who presumably eat when they need to eat, and if there's food there, they eat even if they don't need to eat, but don't have the capacity typically that we humans are imbued with to choose not to eat even when we want to eat, to choose not to eat even when there's food around us to eat. And so that's something that we share in common with each other. And interestingly, across the various cultures and civilizations, the different religious and ethnic groups that have their own traditions, there is repeatedly to be found a tradition of fasting that is connected with that idea of self-discipline, the idea of reflecting, taking time and space, and in a sense being away from our ordinary being, our ordinary time, our ordinary space, to think about where we fit into the world and how we fit in with each other. So that, for example, on the Jewish calendar, when one looks at the Abrahamic traditions, we are approaching the fast which will be the most important day on that calendar, the 10th day of what is referred to in the Torah, or Taurat, as it would be said in Arabic, the Torah, the 10th day of the 7th month that will later on be referred to as Tishrei. That will be called the Day of Atonement, Yom HaKippurim, and it will mark the culmination of what currently Jews who are traditional and observant are engaged in. In the month that precedes Tishrei, the entire month of Elul, they are starting to think about things, think about the year that passed, think about the year that comes. And in the Jewish tradition, the culmination of the month of Elul then leads to the month of Tishrei and 10 days that are called the 10 days of awe, in which one is expected to even one's moral bank account, not only with God, but with one's fellow humans, so that in the course of that time, one not only is engaged in self-reflection and prayer, but in reaching out to those whom one may have ignored or may have offended in the previous year. And the Jewish tradition has it that at the beginning of that month, the gates, as it were, of the Book of Life are opened by God, and on the 10th day, they're sealed for the year to come. And that 10th day is a solemn fast. So a traditional Jew will not eat actually for 25, not 24 hours, because you want to make sure you don't miss any piece of it. So you start a little before sundown and you finish a little bit after sundown. So instead of 24, you fast for 25 hours. And if you're traditional, you don't bathe, you don't shave, you don't do any of the things you might ordinarily do. You spend the entire time in prayer. And in fact, traditional Jews pray 3 times a day ordinarily. And on the Sabbath, there is a 4th series of prayers called additional prayers, but on that Day of Atonement, one prays 5 times. So there are 5 groups of prayers. So it stands out in that respect strongly from the rest of the year. In a way, what one sees having happened is the reshaping of about 24 different actions that when the temple in Jerusalem stood, the high priest would engage in on that day, which included, over the course of the day, 4 changes of his sacred garments, and which culminated with his entering the Holy of Holies, and only on that day. And they tie a rope around his waist, because if he fainted in the context of God, how would they get him out? Because no one but the high priest was allowed in, and only on that day they'd pull him out by the rope. That ultimately leads from this very priestly, highly ritualistic series of customs to a rather simpler, people-wide custom of this extended fast and this extended prayer. And of course, one of the people, back when the temple still stood, who would have visited it, was a guy by the name of Jesus of Nazareth. In the culmination of his career, he arrived in what, in the natural scheme of things, was the spring. Remember, the Day of Atonement falls in the 7th month, according to the Torah. So the first month is the month of Nisan in the spring, and that's the month which is marked in the Israelite calendar by the Passover. And that's when Jesus would have arrived into Jerusalem at the culmination of his public ministry. And it was there that he would be apprehended. It was there that he would be crucified. It would be there, from there, that he would be resurrected, all in the matter of time during that period of the year. And over time, as Christianity has developed, and there are many modes of fast in the Christian tradition, in particular in the Christian monastic traditions, because as a monastic seeks to emulate Jesus by denying his physicality, and one of the ways we can do that is by denying ourselves food, which is so essential to our physicality. Aside from the various monastic movements that prescribed various and sundry kinds of feasts, what became pan-Christian was or fast rather, what became pan-Christian was the fast of Lent. Lent, which, depending upon which kind of Christian you are, offers this or that mode of abstinence, whether it is total abstinence all day long, or whether it is abstaining from a particular delicacy all day and all night long for a 40-day period, 40 days being the traditional length of Lent, that begins in the Western Christian traditions on Ash Wednesday and the Eastern traditions on Ash Monday, and that culminates with Easter, that celebrates the resurrection of Christ 40 days later, except in some traditions it's more than 40 days. So the Ethiopic Church and the Coptic Church and the Eritrean Orthodox Church, for example, celebrate Lent for 55 days. So each of these traditions has within itself sub-traditions with respect to the particulars of how abstinence is practiced. The idea of Lent, of course, is penitence. The idea of Lent is prayer. The idea of Lent is alms. It's self-discipline. It's the same sort of issues and ideas that attach themselves to the 10th day of the 7th month for a 24-25-hour fast for Jews in Christianity for a 40-day period that culminates with Easter. Some of the same sort of principles obtain. And the notion of 40 is most specifically connected by Christian tradition to the notion of Jesus himself being out in the wilderness for 40 days, where he experienced all kinds of temptations that he resisted before beginning his culminating public ministries, which would culminate the culmination with his arrival in Jerusalem and all of the events that transpired there. And as Lent spreads out from Ash Wednesday to Easter, the various traditions emphasize various particular days among those days. So all share in common, for example, the notion of the sixth Sunday being Palm Sunday, which actually marks Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem. Or the Wednesday that follows, known as Spy Wednesday. How many people have heard of Spy Wednesday here in Washington with the Spy Museum? But what's it about? It's the day when Judas spies on Jesus as he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. So there are well-known and less well-known features of the Lenten period that culminates with Easter. And within the context and against the background of these two Abrahamic traditions, Judaism and Christianity, of course, the Prophet Muhammad appears on the scene in the 7th century. And in the text that records the teachings of God through him and to his constituents, known as the Quran, we are told that you are commanded to fast as others before you have. So the Quran lets us understand that the Prophet, peace be unto him, recognizes that he is working within a tradition among traditions, and that there are precedents for the notion of the discipline and the self-reflection that fasts imply. And one of the early hadiths specifically says the Quran is referring to the Jews and to the fast, the Day of Atonement. Other commentators say, no, it's really referring to the Lenten abstinence of the Christians. It doesn't matter. It could be referring to either, neither, both, more. The point, of course, is that he enjoins his followers to fast during the 9-month, the month that had been known as Ramadan even before Islam came into play in that part of the world, and to engage in acts that in particular would acknowledge what we are as a species apart from other species, and emphasize for us patience, humility, spirituality, almsgiving, charity, supplication, prayer, is all part and parcel of Islamic life throughout the year, but in particular during the month of Ramadan. And during the month of Ramadan, one fasts from sunrise to sunset, and as sunset arrives, one feasts, as Jenna pointed out at the outset, with one's family, with one's friends. It's a time to visit. It's a time to spend special time with those whom one loves. That's what the Iftar feast is about. It is in the context of a month that takes its name from an Arabic root, RMD, Ramad, which means something like scorching heat or scorching earth. It also can have the implication of the limits on the availability of food, and it would seem that the early Muslim calendar celebrated Ramadan during the summer. But because that calendar ultimately evolved to be a lunar calendar, which, as you know, means that It follows the pattern of the Earth around the moon around the Earth rather than the Earth around the sun. So it's a calendar which is about 355 days long. So relative to the Gregorian calendar that is in use typically in the United States, for example, it's shifting 10 to 11 days off year by year by year relative to that calendar. So Ramadan occurs at different times of year, but it seems originally to have been associated with the summer, a time when it would be considered most difficult to add to the excruciating heat the discomfort of fasting all day. You are to fast until you can plainly distinguish, you can spend the night feasting and celebrating until in the dawn's light you can distinguish plainly a white thread from a black thread. That is the indicator that the dawn has come, that you must cease your feasting and engage in the self-reflection, the centerpiece of which is fasting, until the evening comes again. Muhammad is said to have said to his followers that during this period the gates of hell are closed, the gates of heaven are open. It's a period, therefore, that parallels the notion within the Jewish tradition of the days of awe and the idea of the opening and closing of gates that pertain to time past and time future. And as with Judaism and Christianity in their tradition, so Islam is not a monolith, but has different traditions within its traditions with respect to what is important about Ramadan. So to give you just one very simple example of this, in the Shia tradition, but not as distinctly in the Sunnah tradition, the second day of Ramadan is understood to be the day when Moses at Sinai got the Torah. And the 12th day of Ramadan is understood to be the day when the Injil, when the Gospels were given to Isa, to Jesus. And the 18th day is the day when the Psalms were understood to have been given to Daud, to King David. So those days are particularly singled out, and singled out for their connection to these prior traditions to which Islam feels so strongly connected. There are throughout, though, the special prayers, the Taraweeh, that are added to the prayers that are said in the course of an ordinary Muslim day, and some spend all night in prayer and not just feasting. The iftar is not just a license to feast, it's a license to cease to fast, but that doesn't mean that one ceases to be self-reflexive or self-reflective. You see your friends, you spend time with your loved ones, but you can also pray, you can also study. It's important, for example, to read the Quran, particularly during Ramadan. And it is a universal tradition that one reads it, 1/30th of it, each night, so that in the course of the month of Ramadan you have read through the entire Quran. The high water mark of the Muslim year comes in the last third of the month of Ramadan. It's an interesting articulation of this principle. Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power, or the night of decree, or the night of measures, it's differently translated. It is the night when the revelation to Muhammad, peace be unto him, first came from God through Gabriel. And what is interesting is that it is understood to have come during the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan, on one of the odd number days. So within the tradition, you could celebrate that moment of moments, the beginning of the revelation to Muhammad, on the 21st or the 23rd or the 25th or the 27th or the 29th day of Ramadan. I assume that in the Rumi Forum, we would celebrate each of those days just to make sure we've got them all covered. To end where I began, if the act of fasting and the act of physical abstinence is designed in part by us as a species, by us in response to imperative from beyond ourselves, to distinguish us from other species, the fact of the different modes of fast that are to be found not only in the three Abrahamic traditions, but across the human family, offer further proof of the way in which we are all threads in a very complex rope that is called humanity. And given the various things that I was listening to on the news as I was driving down here this evening, it's something we need to be ever more than ever aware of. And I thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ori. That was beautiful. Thank you. Now I would like to ask Dr. Pim Valkenberg, also a very good friend of the Rumi Forums, a good friend of ours, to come and speak now. He is a professor at Loyola University of Maryland in Baltimore, and he's going to speak a bit about the Rumi Forum and his work. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Ladies and gentlemen, when Jenna invited me to speak tonight, I was thinking, what shall I do? Because it was my feeling that it was a little bit strange for me, being a Christian theologian, to talk about the Rumi Forum, to talk about Ramadan, to talk about Iftar, since you should be standing here and talk to me about what it means to fast. So I thought, okay, the only way I can do this is to fast with you, at least for one day. And I remember talking to my daughter. I have an older daughter who still lives in the Netherlands. I came from the Netherlands 4 years ago, who said that she was doing that with a couple of friends. And you may know that in the Netherlands the situation between Muslims and other people who call themselves politicians of certain parties is kind of tense. So there was a kind of a demonstration from her side to do that. So I thought, okay, let me do that and let me see what happens. It was kind of difficult because today I had a faculty workshop for a special teaching program that I'm involved in at Loyola University in this fall. It began with a breakfast to get things started, which I had to skip. It went on with a lunch, which I had to skip, and it ended with a dinner, which I had to skip because I had to come here. So, of course, some of my colleagues asked me, are you on a diet? Do you have stomach troubles? What's the matter with you? I remember that I began thinking about the meaning of fasting when one of my students in the Netherlands wanted to write her master's thesis about the meaning of fasting in Islam and Christianity. That was some time ago, some 15 years ago, before I think iftar dinners were as common, although they are not very common, but for some of us they are already very common, not as common as they are now. 10 years ago I was invited to an iftar dinner, and it's always very humbling to think that that was the case, not because of me, but because of my wife, who was a pastoral worker in a church, and she was invited, and I asked her, can I come with you? And I could come, so I was invited as well. And that is when I first met the people from the Hizmet movement, as I prefer to call it, or the movement of people who are inspired by Fethullah Gulen, whom you saw in the presentation earlier today. So that is in fact how my contacts with the different organizations of the Hizmet movement began. One of the things that my student during the writing of her thesis discovered was that we Catholics in the Netherlands had somehow lost the original meaning of fasting. So Uri has been talking splendidly about the original meaning of fasting in the Abrahamic religions, but in the 70s and in the 80s, for Catholics there was a kind of a shift, and I think that's true in some American churches as well, away from, let's say, the theological meaning of fasting to a social justice thing. So fasting meant giving up something in solidarity with the poor, concentrating on their needs, giving the money that you can spare to the third world, or eating only bread and water and giving the remainders to other people. And I think that's some of the things, I mean, we just talked about the iftar tent. That's some of the things that you still do here at Rumi Forum. And I wouldn't say that that was incorrect, but it was a kind of a derived meaning of fasting. So for myself, the thing what always impresses me is and I'm working in the field of interreligious dialogue, is how we can learn from one another. And that is, in fact, what I want to talk about a little bit in the final part of my short presentation. So fasting, I think, and I will now give you kind of a very short parallel of what Uri just said, means three things. First of all, most superficially, it means to struggle with your own self, or just to quote Rumi for one time, to struggle with your nafs, with your soul, with yourself, with your lower inclinations, the baser instincts. Showing that you can overcome the urge for food and water, since there are more important things. That has to do, as I learned, with the virtue of sabr, which is for people who live in the desert, in that hot climate, a very important virtue. Know to wait, to have patience. It's ordinarily translated as patience. I think endurance is much better, because it's a kind of a powerful notion. It's not just be patient. Second, fasting means to concentrate on God. Concentrate, of at least that's for the monotheistic traditions, with your relation on God, and to a certain sense giving back to God what you have received from God. I remember sitting in one of the iftar dinners in the Netherlands, and one of my Muslim friends, we were together with some younger people, because we had a kind of an Abrahamic meeting of younger people, a kind of an Abrahamic youth event. And they were asking all kinds of questions. And it was during Ramadan. At that time it was in October. And they were asking my Muslim friend, why are you fasting? And all kinds of people came up with the ideas that you probably hear around you. It's good for your health system, it's good for your balance, etc., etc. But he ended up saying, well, God commanded it. And I remember that these Dutch boys and girls, they couldn't get it. I mean, so that's one of the elements, I would say, of fasting. It is about your relationship with God. And the third element, which might be the most important, is the social aspect. Coming together, and that is why we are sitting here together. And I know of some research that tells us, at least in Europe, you may know there are in Europe quite a lot of younger Muslims who are Muslims in name, but are not really practicing, not really observant. But they do share the events with Ramadan, because of the social meaning of Ramadan that is very important to them. So it's a time for new relationships, and if some relationships got lost, it's time to work on these relationships once again. So I think one of these relationships that we can renew once again during Ramadan is the relationship between the three Abrahamic religions. And that is because we can learn from one another. At the table here in front, we had a discussion earlier about ignorance being a very important aspect why we now have all these stories about Islam in the United States. Coming from Europe, I'm a little longer familiar, I guess, with some of these stories, but they have to do with a lot of ignorance. And that is why I think there are two texts in the Quran that has been, for me as a Christian theologian, always very important. The first one, and people who are working in dialogue will know the two texts that I will quote. The first text is Surah 49 verse 13. People, we created you all from a single man and a single woman, and made you into nations and tribes, so that you should get to know each other. This idea of getting to know each other, li ta'aruf in Arabic, I think is very important. And then there is this other text that has always puzzled me, from Surah Al-Ma'idah, the Surah of the table. If God wanted, He could have made you one community, but He wanted to test you in what He gave to you. Therefore, emulate one another in doing good. Istabiku al-khairat, which means try to do good try to be a kind of a mirror for another. And I think that's exactly what we can learn from one another's religious practices or other practices where we do good. If we see others doing these things, we reflect on our own traditions and see how we can improve what God has given to us. And that, for me, is the deepest meaning for interreligious dialogue. And I would really wish and hope that we, as Christians, Jews and Muslims, will act according to this divine wish. Not the political troubles associated with Ground Zero and new mosques, but trying to serve others in order to please God. And if I may summarize in one sentence what Jenna announced as the topic of my talk, namely what I learned from Rumi Forum and what I learned from Hoxha Effendi, from Fethullah Gulen, it is exactly that, to serve others, not because they will give you back, not because you will be famous or whatever, but because that is something that God has given you to do, and in the end you hope to give that back to the one who has created you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pim. Now I would like to ask our president, Mr. Emre Çelik. He's been with us now for just a year. It's been a wonderful year, and I hope many more to come, many more Ramadan and Ramadan Iftars to come. So please welcome Mr. Emre Çelik to the stage.
Good evening, distinguished guests. Yes, as Jenna has alluded to, it's been a nice learning experience for the last 12 months, and if you haven't worked out from my accent yet, it's definitely not Israeli or Pakistani, as many people have guessed. I'm from Australia, and as one person guessed, they thought I was from Brooklyn. I'm not from Brooklyn either. As I was leaving Australia, just an anecdote of my departure. Greg Barton, a close friend and a scholar on Islam in the Muslim world, sitting across from an academic, was a standard at the sad face of the academic, another friend of mine, Ismail. And Greg asked, he said, "Why are you so saddened on this occasion?" He said, "Haven't you heard the bad news?" And Greg said, what bad news is that? He said, "We're losing Emre. Australia's losing Emre." And Greg looked back a little bit smugly and he said, "Yes, that is very sad news. We're very upset. But think about how upset Washington is." Having said that, it's been 12 months. It's been a very nice 12 months. It is no coincidence, and somewhat it is, that my two previous speakers reflect the chronology of the Abrahamic faiths. We had Ori of Jewish background, we had Pim of Christian background, and myself finally of Muslim background. We hadn't planned that, but it's worked out to be that. But the Rumi Forum is indicative of that, of reflecting people of all different backgrounds, giving them an opportunity to speak, to voice their concern, irrespective of whether we accept, believe. We want to support all people of all backgrounds and be a platform, as it were, and as our name suggests, a forum. We make no distinction or difference based on ethnicity, faith, political persuasion, or otherwise. And this has been particularly taught to us by our honorary president. We are very honored, and some of you may know, I suspect many don't, Fethullah Gulen, who has inspired the founding of this organization, and many of such organizations around the world, maybe coming on 400 dialogue organizations. I come from Australia. I've been involved for the last 20 years in similar organizations, though my background is of different professional background, and coming on close to similar other institutions that espouse these values of dialogue, of respect, within the framework of education. More than 1,000 schools in 110 countries, within the framework of what is usually referred to in the Western media and by Western academics as the Gulen movement, but as Pim referred to, as we refer to ourselves, as Hizmet, which in Turkish, and I think it comes from the Arabic, meaning service. And this is of utmost importance, to know one another and this has also been one of the important aspects of dialogue as espoused by the President as well, not to keep it at the dialogue level, but to serve one another and increase understanding between communities and cultures as a result of such service. Ramadan has been explained, fasting has been explained. I hope you appreciate what it means for the Muslim community and the importance that Ramadan is. This is one aspect of it, the reflection, the worship, the self-analysis, all those have been alluded to. But I do thank each and every one of you for coming and sharing in that social aspect of Ramadan. According to a Muslim tradition, it is said that the guest brings with them 10 blessings, and when they leave with only one. 9 of them have been left for the host. So without you, this would be a barren place in terms of blessings at least. So I thank you for each and every one of the steps you took to come here. We are both honored and privileged, and I do look forward to seeing each and every one of you at future events, whether they be dinners. Of course, already alluded to everything that we do includes a food component. He is not wrong. So if not for the speaker, if not for me, please at least attend for the food. I'm sure you will enjoy it. And anything above that, I'm sure you would consider a bonus. And just as a small side before I complete, along with this type of event, we're probably doing 30 or 40 of these types of dinners throughout Ramadan in our chapters across Delaware, Maryland, of course DC, Fairfax, North Carolina and Kentucky. We have about 9-12 chapters, so we're doing about 30-40 of these types of dinners. We're holding home iftars. We have a vast network of homes where we invite guests into our homes as well. And this coming Thursday, Friday and Saturday, 26, 27 and 28th August in Fairfax, we're opening up along with our sister organisation, which is ATFA, American Turkish Friendship Association, a Ramadan tent, so that guests like yourselves can bring family and friends and children, anybody. No need to RSVP, you're all welcome, but the details and address you can acquire from myself a later date. I think it's on our website as well, or just email us from the invitation you receive. You're all welcome to bring friends. Every night there is 600-700 people fed. Everyone is welcome. So this is part of our mission of hopefully reaching out to one and all without discriminating against anybody, and we're doing our best to do that. Again, thank you. Jenna has one final word before the evening formally wraps up. There is some entertainment in the side room, and I hope you're able to join us for some sweets and tea and the artwork there. Thank you and have a blessed evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. If you would all please join us in the other room, it would be wonderful. There's Turkish coffee, apple tea, Turkish tea, baklava, Turkish delight, and a beautiful Ebru presentation. But in addition to that, we'd also love to have you join us all the time. The Rumi Forum has luncheons and evening events, and we have members of our audience this evening who have spoken at those luncheons. And so we encourage you to come back anytime. We would love to host you again and again. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you later in the evening. Thank you.